The Muslims called it Al-Andalus. In 711, Muslim forces landed on the shores of Iberia, a rectangular peninsula shared by Portugal and Spain. And in a few years' time, most of the Iberian landmass was under Muslim control. From their strongholds in the north, the rulers of independent Christian kingdoms launched the Reconquista, a protracted military campaign aimed at driving the Muslims from Iberia completely, with the ultimate goal of reclaiming the entire peninsula for the Church. The campaign officially began in 722, when the Christian forces of Asturias secured a small but symbolically significant victory at the Battle of Covadonga. It would continue for nearly 800 years. For the most part, the Reconquista was an effort waged by the northern realms of Leon, Navarre, and Catalonia, whose ruling noble families were closely allied with the papacy. But aside from their Catholic faith, the people of these kingdoms lacked a common identity, and they had no shared history to unite them by tribe or ethnicity. Naturally, their rulers quarreled with one another, and their kingdoms united and divided several times. The Reconquista made little progress until the collapse of the Caliphate of Cordoba in southern Spain around 1031 eliminated the most powerful Islamic kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. And this finally created the opportunity for the territorial gains that would bring the Reconquista to victory. In 1063, William VII of Aquitaine led a force of French, Aragonese, and Catalan knights in the long siege of Barbastro and successfully captured the city, bringing centuries of Muslim rule to an end. Following their victory, Pope Alexander rewarded the participants with indulgences, official certificates that guaranteed the forgiveness of sins. In the following decades, the papacy increasingly used the conflict in Iberia as an outlet to absorb some of the excessive violence that plagued medieval Europe. The conflict in Spain became an international holy war, redirecting some of that violent energy away from the European countryside and against the Muslims in Spain. The First Crusade was merely a continuation of this same idea, only in the east instead of the west. And roughly 90 years after it began, another generation of Crusaders set out in 1147 from the port of Dartmouth in England. From there they headed south, intending to reach the Holy Land by sea. But the fleet encountered bad weather while sailing down the western coast of Iberia, forcing them to stop at the northern city of Porto in mid-June to wait out the storm. And while the eager young men on board had every intention of fulfilling their vows as soon as the weather cleared up, they were also intrigued to learn that King Alfonso I of Portugal had a proposal for them. As it turned out, the King of Portugal was requesting their military services as hired mercenaries to assist him in a planned attack on Lisbon, a larger port further south along the coast still under Muslim control. King Alfonso admitted up front that he did not have the funds to pay them directly for their troubles. Instead, he promised the Crusaders exclusive rights to pillage the city's goods and assured them they would have first pick in the loot, as Lisbon was a very wealthy city. That was, of course, in addition to the expected ransom money the Crusaders could collect in exchange for any high-value prisoners they managed to capture during the assault. The Crusaders agreed. After all, the Pope had officially authorized the extension of the crusade into the Iberian Peninsula already, so they were still fulfilling their vows. The Crusaders began their siege of Lisbon on the 1st of July. 4 months later, the city's local Muslim rulers surrendered in the face of widespread hunger. Following the capture of Lisbon, most of the Crusaders chose to stay and settle in the city, which became the new capital of the Kingdom of Portugal. The rest sailed on to the Holy Land. Around the same time, a different King Alfonso was preparing an attack on a different Iberian city, the wealthy port of Almeria. He was Alfonso VII, ruler of the northern kingdom of Leon, and he was not alone. Joining him was Ramon Berenguer IV, Count of Barcelona, as well as many other influential noblemen whose forces mostly consisted of French, Catalan, Leonese, and Castilian mercenaries. And with naval support from the Italian states of Pisa and Genoa, their combined forces successfully captured Almeria by October 1147. After this victory, Ramon Berenguer then rode off to invade the lands of the Almoravid kingdoms of Valencia and Murcia. There, Ramon and a team of Crusader mercenaries besieged the city of Tortosa for 5 months straight before it finally fell. Once Tortosa had been captured, Ramon ensured that those who assisted him were rewarded with lands within and around the vicinity of the newly conquered city. Ramon Berenguer would go on to win several more victories. The following year, Ramon successfully captured Fraga, Lleida, and Mequinenza, a cluster of cities located in the confluence of two rivers. From that point onward, the Reconquista turned decidedly in favor of Christian forces, and the war remained in their favor until they eventually declared victory towards the end of the 15th century. For the Latin Church, the Holy War in the West seemed promising. As for the other Holy War in the East, well, that was quite a different story. 100 years after the First Crusade, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem remained under Christian rule, a tiny feudal state on the Syrian coast, surrounded by hostile neighbors. Indeed, the European Catholic nobility that ruled the kingdom quarreled with the Catholic rulers of the other three Crusader states no less than they did with their nearby Muslim enemies. And Jerusalem was diplomatically isolated as a result, and had become an unpredictable rogue state from the perspective of its neighbors, as well as an international pariah, aside from the handful of allies it still retained in Europe. And to make the situation as convoluted as possible, the capital city of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer Jerusalem itself, and in fact no longer controlled the actual city of Jerusalem at all. The city itself had been recaptured by Muslim forces, and had since become part of the new Ayyubid Sultanate, ruled by Saladin from his capital in Cairo. Saladin was an ambitious warlord from North Africa, and he was very eager to project his influence and expand his territory as far as he possibly could, hoping to unite the fractured Islamic world. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Jerusalem moved its capital to the fortified city of Acre after losing the city of Jerusalem to the Muslims. And the rulers of the Crusader kingdom remained in control of most of the coastline of the Levant, as well as southern and central Lebanon, including the strongholds and towns of Jaffa, Arsuf, Caesarea, Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, along with a few other significant cities, as well as some interior fortresses, and the important port city of Ascalon. By the time Saladin died of yellow fever in 1193, the fledgling Ayyubid Empire was fractured by civil war as his sons competed bitterly for the right to inherit their father's territories. Meanwhile, in Europe, schemes were hatched to reconquer the city of Jerusalem on behalf of the rogue Crusader kingdom. However, in 1197, a group of crusaders from Germany went rogue themselves and wreaked absolute havoc in the Holy Land. The German crusaders decided to launch their own crusade independently of the church, and without the knowledge of the papacy. In fact, the German crusaders also neglected to inform the Kingdom of Jerusalem of their activities in the Holy Land, or even their presence in the region at all. Nevertheless, the crusaders arrived in the Holy Land and immediately crossed into the territory of Al-Adil, one of Saladin's sons, and proceeded to attack his troops. Thinking the Germans had been sent by Jerusalem, Al-Adil attacked Jaffa in retaliation and successfully captured the city. Meanwhile, the German crusaders had already moved on to wreak havoc further north, where they successfully captured Beirut. Al-Adil made peace with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and both parties signed a treaty preserving the status quo. In March 1204, Al-Adil won the civil war against his brothers, and reunited his father's former territories shortly before the expiration of the truce. Now the Kingdom of Jerusalem was surrounded, but Iberia and the Holy Land were far from the only regions in turmoil. By the turn of the 13th century, the Eastern Roman Empire was already 900 years old, and its capital in Constantinople had preserved the infrastructure of the classical world, while Roman civic structures remained intact. Countless visitors to the city marveled at its ornate bathhouses and visited the public forum, and they wrote about how impressed they had been at the condition of the city's ancient aqueducts, still functioning perfectly since the days of antiquity. With its formidable walls, Constantinople was thought to be the most well-defended city in the world at that time. Constructed during the 4th century, the walls were triple-layered and surrounded the city's perimeter, encircling Constantinople with both land and sea walls. But but the city's natural geography played an equally vital role in its defensive capabilities. Constantinople was built on a slab of rock that extends out into the Bosporus from the edge of continental Europe, forming a natural peninsula. That region of the Bosporus is called the Sea of Marmara, and Constantinople happens to stand at its narrowest point, where the continents of Asia and Europe come close to touching. The city was truly magnificent, but the Eastern Roman Empire had many, many enemies, and the Greek nobility who ruled in Constantinople clung blindly to tradition, and thus became blind themselves. And for the sin of ignorance they would pay dearly. The Greek-speaking families of the ruling nobility in Constantinople were arch-reactionaries determined to prevent change at any cost, and they wanted nothing more than to freeze in place the social conditions of antiquity on a permanent basis. But the world had left them behind. In the Eastern Roman Empire, no new books were published, only new copies of much older texts, rewritten in different languages and translations. And far from containing forgotten wisdom from the ancient world, these old texts were strictly Christian, and only those ideologically aligned with the doctrine of the Eastern Orthodox Church. The result was a cultural stagnation and lack of innovation that ultimately doomed the empire. In fact, when the magnificent cathedral of the Hagia Sophia was in need of repairs, the Eastern Romans had already forgotten the architectural knowledge necessary to maintain the structure, as their architects never learned the sacred geometry so carelessly discarded by the imperial regime, despite being standard knowledge in most of the civilized world. And while the ancient Greeks had known the earth was a sphere for millennia by that point, their descendants managed to lose that knowledge as well. Instead, the ruling nobility adopted a literalist interpretation of the Bible, having forgotten the layers of symbolic meaning and esoteric wisdom contained within their own holy text. For them, the world was just 6,000 years old, and Adam and Eve were literal people in an actual garden somewhere on Earth. But the ruling class was delusional, for they could not understand. Society cannot be frozen in place, and in their stubborn refusal to change, the Greek nobility sealed their own fate. By 1195, Eastern Roman Emperor Isaac II Angelus had fallen out of favor with the nobility. Isaac had allowed the treasury to dwindle, and he had outsourced the entire Roman navy to the scheming Venetians, whose merchant rulers had long set their sights on Constantinople, waiting for the opportunity to sink their teeth into the empire's great wealth. Inevitably, Isaac was deposed by the nobility, who then placed his brother on the imperial throne, who began ruling as Alexios III. Seeking to neutralize his brother as a future political threat, the new emperor had Isaac blinded and exiled upon taking power. But Alexios III would turn out no better. The new emperor bankrupted the treasury, and his regime was notoriously corrupt, so much so that his chief admiral, Michael Strophanos, sold off the entire Roman naval fleet solely to enrich himself, down to the very nails that held the actual ships together. In January 1198, Pope Innocent III became the new leader of the Western Church in Rome, and the new pope was eager to launch another crusade. In fact, there had already been 2 other crusade expeditions since the original crusade 100 years earlier. The second one was a total disaster, and the third, despite all the hype surrounding it, did not accomplish much of anything. With the city of Jerusalem still under Muslim control, Pope Innocent could certainly justify a 4th crusade to the public. The challenge was generating widespread support. He needed help spreading his message, and for this he turned to one of his influential allies, Boniface of Montferrat. Boniface came from a powerful noble family from the region of Montferrat in northern Italy, and he also happened to be the Marquis of Montferrat. And ever since he assumed that title, Boniface had become a significant figure in the politics of feudal Europe, and he carried plenty of influence. So when the Pope reached out requesting his help, Boniface was glad to use his connections. In 1200, Boniface and other influential figures sent envoys to Venice, Genoa, and several other independent city-states along the Italian coast with a request to negotiate a contract to transport the Crusaders to the North African coast to launch a surprise attack on Egypt. It was an ambitious maritime enterprise that required a huge fleet of ships, and most states were simply not in the position to take on such a project. Venice, on the other hand, was intrigued. The Republic of Venice was a corrupt plutocracy run by a wealthy merchant class whose wealth was measured in gold and silver coins instead of land. Their elected leader was called the Doge of Venice, which at the time was a man named Enrico Dandolo. Speaking on behalf of the Venetian Republic, Doge Dandolo agreed to transport more than 33,000 Crusaders to Egypt, as the Venetians were eager to open new commercial opportunities as long as they were profitable. The project was a massive endeavor, and it required an entire year of preparation for the Venetians, as they would need to build numerous ships and then train the sailors who would be operating them, while curtailing the city's usual commercial activities. The contract was signed, and the wheels of the Fourth Crusade were set in motion. The Crusaders themselves were recruited from all over Europe, including all of France, as well as Flanders and Montferrat, while others hailed from different regions of the Holy Roman Empire, a confederation of feudal states encompassing most of Central Europe. That was in addition to the small force of Venetian soldiers who planned to depart with the expedition as well, plus the thousands of non-combatants who would operate the ships. In total, the number of expected Crusaders was projected at around 4,500 professionally trained knights and their horses, 9,000 squires, and as many as 20,000 foot soldiers. The expedition was scheduled to depart on the 24th of June 1203. The plan was to sail directly to North Africa, where they would enter the mouth of the Nile and follow it straight into Cairo to attack the Ibid capital. The mission received the Pope's approval, though it came with a solemn warning not to attack other Christian states. But by May 1202, most of the Crusaders had congregated in Venice, and it was already obvious to the Crusaders and the Venetians that everyone involved faced a gigantic problem. The number of Crusaders that showed up in Venice was nowhere near the expected 33,000 the Venetians had planned for. In fact, the number of Crusaders in Venice was barely 12,000. This was a serious problem. The contract was based on the much higher projected number, and the only reason the Venetians had halted commercial activity in their city for an entire year to focus on the project was because the 85,000 silver marks that was promised to them in the contract was far greater than the average annual income for the Republic of Venice, so it was well worth the disruption. And as far as the Venetians were concerned, they had upheld their end of the deal, and a contract was a contract. That not nearly as many Crusaders showed up as the Crusade organizers had initially assumed had nothing to do with Venice. They did their part, and they wanted what they were owed. But when the Crusaders could only come up with 35,000 silver marks, Doge Dandolo refused to allow the expedition to leave until the Venetians received the full payment. And while the Crusade leaders managed to squeeze an additional 14,000 out of them, it still barely covered half the balance. Dandolo and the Senate met to discuss what to do. The Crusader forces were too small to realistically pay what they owed, but the Venetians couldn't just send them away either, as it would severely harm Venetian prestige and result in significant financial loss for the Republic, and could even jeopardize future business prospects. But eventually, the Venetians came up with an idea. Dandolo proposed the Crusaders could pay off the bulk of what they owed by completing a mission on behalf of the Venetians. A quick mercenary job, and low risk in terms of danger, the Doge assured them. All they would have to do, Dandolo explained, was to sail down the Adriatic coast and simply intimidate several key ports in nearby towns, culminating in an attack on the port of Zara in Dalmatia. At one time, the Venetians had exercised total economic domination over the city of Zara, until its leaders rallied their people to join them in rebellion against Venice in 1191. Zara had forged an alliance with King Emmerich of Hungary and Croatia, placing the city under his protection. Subsequent attempts by the Venetians to reassert control over Zara's economy had been repulsed. So Doge Dandolo suggested the Crusaders could help take it back. But the reaction among the Crusaders was mixed, and many of them were vehemently opposed to attacking Zara. After all, they were fellow Catholics, and King Emmerich was a lifelong ally of the Latin Church and the papacy. But the bulk of the Crusader forces agreed to go through with it, and they prepared to set out to begin the mission. When word got back to Pope Innocent, he was alarmed, and he sent out a letter to the Crusaders, threatening excommunication if they committed any atrocious acts against their fellow Christian neighbors. But the letter may not have reached them in time. The Crusader fleet arrived at Zara by November 1202 and prepared to attack the city. The citizens of Zara had attempted to prevent it by hanging large banners marked with crosses from their windows, draping them down the city walls in the hope that the Crusaders would change their minds once they realized they were fellow Catholics. But these efforts failed to prevent the attack, and after a brief siege, Zara fell to the Crusaders on the 24th. The Crusaders pillaged and looted extensively, and after some quarreling with the Venetians over the division of the spoils, order was achieved, and the fortifications of Zara were demolished by the Venetians. The Crusade leaders decided to remain in Zara for the remainder of the winter, allowing them time to plan their next move. When Pope Innocent learned of the attack, he reacted with disgust. He sent a letter to the Crusade leadership excommunicating the entire army. He ordered them to return to the fulfillment of their holy vows, and to head for Jerusalem at once. But upon receiving the letter, the Crusade leaders chose to keep it a secret from their troops, fearing it could result in the dissolution of the army. But they had no intention of going anywhere near the Holy Land. At least not anytime soon. After all, there were far more personal scores to settle first. The mutual animosity between the Venetians and their Greek neighbors in the Eastern Roman Empire went far deeper than their longtime commercial rivalry. In 1182, the Latin population in Constantinople is estimated to have been around 60,000. And despite being a small minority, these Latin Catholics had dominated the city's maritime trade, as well as its financial sector. And the local people, the majority of them Greek Orthodox, had grown weary of the Latin presence as a result. The Latin minority was arrogant and disrespectful, and their behavior would finally result in consequences for them when the people of Constantinople finally massacred the Latin population, while around 4,000 of them were captured alive and sold as slaves to the Seljuk Turks. A hard lesson in proper behavior for the disrespectful Latins. Naturally, the incident exacerbated the mutual hostility already present between the Venetians and the Greeks. Doge Enrico Dandolo himself was blinded by Eastern Roman Emperor Manuel I Comnenus while in Constantinople as part of a diplomatic embassy decades earlier. And needless to say, he still held a grudge. Meanwhile, Boniface of Montferrat had not participated in the attack on Zara, as he was visiting his cousin, Philip of Swabia, at the time. And while the initial reasons for his visit are a matter of debate, Boniface arrived at Philip's court to find that his cousin was already hosting another guest. His name was Alexios IV Angelos, Philip's brother-in-law. He also happened to be the son of the recently deposed Eastern Roman Emperor Isaac II Angelos. Alexios IV had fled to Philip's court in 1201 to escape the political drama in Constantinople. And shortly after meeting Boniface of Montferrat, Alexios offered to pay off the entire debt owed to the Venetians. In fact, he went a lot further than that, promising that not only would he settle their account with the Venetian Republic, but Alexios also promised an additional 200,000 silver marks for the Crusaders. Alexios also pledged to provide 10,000 Roman soldiers to accompany the expedition to Egypt, for which he also offered the services of the Roman navy to transport them to North Africa. Alexios even promised to place the Eastern Orthodox Church under the authority of the papacy. All the Crusaders would have to do was to sail to Constantinople and overthrow his uncle, Alexios III. As soon as the Crusaders had installed Alexios IV on the imperial throne, he could then access the Roman treasury in Constantinople to pay them what he promised, and he would also have the resources of the Roman state at his disposal for their use. The Crusader army learned of Alexios IV and his offer at the beginning of 1203, and it was simply too tempting not to accept. When winter was over, the Crusaders departed Zara and sailed to Corfu, where they were joined by Boniface and his new friend, Alexios IV. Then, the Crusaders set sail for Constantinople. Their fleet consisted of 60 war galleys, 100 horse transports, and 50 large transport units, while the ships themselves were manned by a large team of 10,000 Venetian oarsmen. The Crusaders also brought along 300 siege engines. After all, the walls of Constantinople were thought to be impenetrable. The Crusader fleet reached the city on the 23rd of June, and their arrival was clearly unexpected. The permanent garrison stationed in Constantinople had been significantly reduced in recent years, so that 500,000 people relied on a garrison of just 15,000 men and a fleet of 20 galleys to defend the capital. Around 5,000 of that number included an elite military unit called the Varangian Guard, composed entirely of foreign mercenaries, mostly of Scandinavian origin. Caught off guard by the Crusaders' arrival, the city's defenders prepared to resist the impending attack. Simultaneously, the Crusaders prepared for their assault on Constantinople. As the Crusader fleet crossed the Bosporus to take the city by force, a Roman army was waiting for them, lined up along the shoreline in full battle formation. But the Crusaders did not hesitate. The Crusader knights approached the shore and boldly charged straight out of the horse transports, prompting the Roman soldiers to break and flee towards the south in a panic. The Crusaders pursued them as they fled towards the suburb of Galata, heading straight for the small fortress at its northern end. The Romans retreated behind its walls and barricaded themselves within it, securing the stronghold by the time the Crusaders could reach it. But the fortress of Galata also held the northern end of a massive chain that blocked the mouth of the Golden Horn, a natural harbor with only one access point for all ships entering and leaving. Incredibly, the largest ship in the Crusader fleet finally managed to break the chain in half, sailing right into the harbor unopposed. Meanwhile, the Crusaders continued to assault the Tower of Galata, and eventually managed to break in. Its defenders suffered bloody losses and were all killed, either from being cut down by the Crusader troops or from drowning in the Bosporus while attempting to escape. Meanwhile, the Crusader fleet sailed alongside the seawall in a procession of 10 galley ships, ensuring Alexios IV was in full view for the crowds of onlookers gathered along the top of the wall. From the moment he had joined the Crusader fleet, Alexios IV had assured the Crusade leaders of the widespread support he enjoyed among the people of Constantinople, and had even insisted that his arrival would likely be met with cheering crowds. Overjoyed to see the rightful heir return to the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire at last. But this was clearly not true, and it was becoming more and more obvious. In reality, the citizens of Constantinople were not at all invested in the cause of a deposed emperor and his exiled son. In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire had never even adopted the practice of hereditary right of succession. A palace coup between rival aristocratic brothers was of no concern to the common people, and they did not consider it illegitimate in the same way it would have been in the feudal West. And so, as Alexios IV smiled and waved from the deck of his ship, in full view of the growing crowd looking down at him from the top of the wall, no one clapped or cheered when they saw him. In fact, the residents of the city were clearly yelling insults and taunting the puzzled Crusaders as they passed. After capturing Galata, the Crusader armies advanced to the base of the city walls, taking position opposite the fortress of Blachernae on the northwest corner of Constantinople. There, the Crusaders began their initial attack on the city walls, while the Venetian fleet attacked the seawall from the Golden Horn simultaneously. As for the corrupt emperor himself, Alexios III was terrified of facing the Crusaders in battle. He also knew that if he didn't, he would likely suffer a fate even worse than his brother Isaac. With no other way around it, Alexios III prepared to lead 17 divisions of his army from the St. Romulus Gate to confront the enemy, and with at least 5,000 more troops at his command than the Crusaders had on their side, Alexios certainly had a numerical advantage. But the emperor's courage ultimately failed, and instead of defending the city, Alexios III proceeded to humiliate himself, and the entire city of Constantinople along with it. After returning with his army without even attempting to fight the Crusaders, the disgraced emperor managed to slip away during the night, quietly escaping the city and abandoning his subjects before anyone had even noticed his absence. After realizing what had happened, imperial officials in the city quickly deposed their runaway emperor and restored Isaac II to the throne, despite his blindness. The Crusade leaders declared that they would only recognize the new regime if Alexios IV was allowed to rule alongside his father as co-emperor. This demand was then granted, and Alexios IV Angelus ascended the throne as emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, alongside his father Isaac. The Crusaders had achieved their objective without even capturing the city. But as soon as he took the throne, Alexios discovered that the treasury was nearly empty, as his disgraced uncle had raided it before fleeing Constantinople with at least 1,000 pounds of gold and as many priceless jewels as he could physically carry. And there was not nearly enough left in the treasury to pay the Crusaders the 200,000 silver marks that Alexios had initially promised them. Desperate and out of options, the young emperor issued a general decree, ordering the destruction of valuable Roman icons, which were to be melted down and requisitioned by the state. But after extracting every last trace of gold and silver contained within every priceless artifact in Constantinople, Alexios was still barely able to come up with 100,000 silver marks to pay the Crusaders, which was only half of what he owed them. But Alexios had an idea. Alexios had been informed that his deposed uncle had fled to Adrianople, and he began recruiting from among the Crusaders, whose forces were still encamped outside the city walls. After gathering his small army, Emperor Alexios departed Constantinople with a contingent of 6,000 Crusader knights and set out to deal with his uncle and retrieve what he stole from the treasury. But the situation in the capital deteriorated in his absence, and riots broke out in August that killed many of the city's Latin residents. In retaliation, the Venetians firebombed a section of the city, resulting in a fire that burned for 2 days straight during the hottest part of summer, reducing a large portion of the city's buildings to piles of ash and left 100,000 people homeless by the time it had been put out. Isaac II died in January 1204, leaving his son to rule as the only emperor. And by that point, Alexios IV had sealed his fate. While Emperor Alexios IV Angelos welcomed the Crusader presence outside the city walls, most of the ruling nobility despised the Latin Crusaders for obvious reasons. The de facto leader of the anti-Latin faction in Constantinople was Alexios Doukas, and he had won the respect of the military and the common people already, having already demonstrated his strategic and leadership skills during the initial clashes when the Crusaders first arrived outside Constantinople. Needless to say, Doukas was well placed to move against Emperor Alexios IV. Doukas organized a coup against the young emperor, and Alexios IV Angelos was ultimately strangled to death while in custody. Doukas ascended the imperial throne in his place, ruling as Emperor Alexios V Doukas Mortsouflos. And as soon as he was crowned, the new emperor immediately began strengthening the city's fortifications and summoned additional forces to the capital. When the Crusaders learned their patron had been murdered in a coup, the leaders demanded Doukas honor the contract agreed upon by his predecessor. And when he refused to do so, the Crusaders attacked Constantinople again, attempting to break into the city. But its defenders mounted a fierce resistance, destroying many of their siege engines by hurling enormous stone projectiles over the walls of the city from inside. The siege dragged on into mid-spring. Meanwhile, a contingent of Crusader troops attempted to assault the seawall from their ships, but a fierce wind blew from the shore, making it difficult for them to get close enough to actually attack the wall. Finally, they got their ships close enough to engage 5 towers along the seawall, but by the afternoon they still had not captured even 1 tower, and the Crusaders were forced to regroup. Fortunately for the Crusaders, however, events inside the city were about to turn the siege in their favor, and things escalated very quickly. First, the Varangian Guard quit their jobs and left Constantinople. They were mercenaries, after all, and their loyalty only lasted for as long as they were getting paid, and when their employers in Constantinople stopped paying them, they no longer had any reason to defend the city. So they left. Later that night, the emperor himself also fled the city. Meanwhile, the weather improved over the following couple of days, and a strong northern wind worked in favor of the Venetian contingent assaulting the sea wall. The Crusaders managed to keep their ships close enough to the wall for some of their troops to climb onto the wall, and after a short battle, a force of around 70 Crusaders successfully broke into the city's interior. Nearby, a different contingent assaulting the city walls from land managed to breach the perimeter on another part of the wall by knocking holes through the stone in the more degraded sections worn down significantly by the fighting. And with some determination and manpower, these efforts eventually broke through the wall completely to the other side, creating a hole just large enough for a few knights to crawl through at a time. And as they quietly filed into the city's interior, the Venetians were scaling the seawall and making some headway in fighting off its defenders. Then Constantinople was dealt another blow when their Anglo-Saxon axe-bearers began to disperse or surrender to the attackers. They too were foreign mercenaries, and they had also not been paid. Soon Crusader forces had infiltrated the city from its northern wall, and they quickly captured the Blackstone fortress in the northwestern corner of Constantinople. The Crusaders took over the stronghold and established Blackstone as a forward operating base, from which they could now launch attacks on the city from within it. The Crusaders began a new offensive, launching assaults on targets further into the city's interior, and with each new wave of attacks, the Crusaders made significant progress. Finally, on the 13th of April, the Crusaders captured Constantinople. The Crusaders then sacked the city. It continued for 3 days straight. In fact, the sack of Constantinople is widely considered one of the most savage and destructive in recorded history. The sheer volume of priceless works of Greco-Roman art that was stolen or destroyed by the Crusaders is shocking on its own, let alone when included with the total destruction done to the city and its inhabitants. The Crusaders murdered civilians with impunity and looted whatever property they had. They also targeted Orthodox churches and monasteries, which the Crusaders destroyed, defiled, and looted. In addition to the valuable loot collected throughout the city, the Crusaders also found plenty of money as well in the homes of the wealthy, amounting to roughly 900,000 silver marks between the Venetians and the rest of the Crusade leadership. as well as the many knights who secretly pocketed the money they found as they rampaged through every home and building in the entire city. The behavior of the Latin invaders was absolutely shocking, so much that many of the city's residents would later remark that they would have preferred the Turks to sack the city than the Latin Catholics. When Pope Innocent III was told about the conduct of his pilgrims, he was filled with shame and rage, and strongly rebuked them for what they had done. When the rampage was over, the Venetians made a treaty with the Crusade leaders, establishing the new Latin Empire of Constantinople, dividing what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire between the various Crusade leaders and the Republic of Venice. And after some deliberation over who the emperor should be, the choice came down to Boniface of Montferrat and Baldwin of Flanders. Ultimately, Baldwin was placed on the imperial throne, becoming the first Catholic ruler of Constantinople. Undeterred, Boniface went on to form his own state on land carved from the territories of the former Eastern Roman Empire. Thus, Boniface became the first ruler of the newly established Kingdom of Thessalonica, a vassal state of the Latin Empire. Meanwhile, the Venetians took the opportunity to expand their influence to the Aegean Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, where they established a colony known as the Duchy of the Archipelago. After the fall of Constantinople, the exiled Greek nobility plotted endlessly to restore the empire they had lost, and many of them went on to establish their own states on its former territory, each one asserting their right to claim the political legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire as its historical successor. Prominent among these successor states was the Empire of Nicaea under Theodore Lascaris, which became a formidable regional power in its own right. Similarly, the Empire of Trebizond wielded considerable influence, and the Despotate of Epirus was also a significant player among the successor states. Needless to say, the new Latin Empire had many enemies, and the Crusaders themselves were universally despised. And aside from their Greek enemies in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus, the Catholic regime in Constantinople was hated by all of its neighbors. Surrounded by hostile states, Constantinople was threatened by a growing list of enemies, including the Christian rulers of the Second Bulgarian Empire, Wallachia, in various parts of the Balkans, as well as the Islamic Sultanate of Rum under the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. Ultimately, the Latin Empire came to an end when Constantinople was captured by the Empire of Nicaea, whose ruler, Michael VIII Palaiologos, arrived with his army in 1261 and took control of Constantinople with naval assistance from Genoa. Michael dismantled the Latin regime and restored the Eastern Roman Empire to power, re-establishing Constantinople as its capital and crowning himself emperor. Thus began the rule of the Palaiologos dynasty. Unbeknownst to Emperor Michael, however, the Palaiologos dynasty would also be the last. The Eastern Roman Empire never recovered its former borders, and remained a diminished version of what it once was. After its restoration, much of southern Greece and the Greek islands remained under the rule of individual Crusader warlords, Italian noble families, and Venetian merchants. Thus, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to decline over the next several decades. Around the middle of the 14th century, the world was faced with a catastrophic pandemic caused by the deadly bacteria Yersinia pestis, or bubonic plague. The disease ravaged Constantinople, and the population struggled to recover in the decades that followed. By the turn of the 15th century, visitors to Constantinople witnessed a city that had become a mere shadow of its former self. Behind the walls of Constantinople, the population was sparse, and the actual city looked more like clusters of modest villages congregated around the base of the Cathedral of the Hagia Sophia. At that point, the territory of the Eastern Roman Empire had been reduced to a small portion of the Balkans and the areas directly surrounding Constantinople itself. And by the time the Ottoman Turks showed up outside the city walls in 1453 to besiege Constantinople, the city's defenders could do little more than pray its ancient walls would hold. As the small garrison defending the city stood no chance against the much larger Ottoman army. And with the largest gun in the world in his possession, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II led his forces into Constantinople after blasting a gigantic hole through the city walls. As for the Crusades, well, the fourth one was certainly not the last. A fifth crusade was organized a few years after the sack of Constantinople, aiming to complete the original mission of the Fourth Crusade, before the expedition had veered off from its intended goal. The Fifth Crusade organized a fleet of ships and sailed to North Africa, where they intended to attack Cairo by surprise. But rather than sail into the Nile, the Crusaders decided they would land nearby and approach the city on foot. However, the Crusaders got bogged down outside the port of Damietta, and a poorly executed attempt to march on Cairo turned into a disaster for the Crusaders. At that point, the idea of international holy war had become a useful political tool for the papacy, and enabled the Church to direct military force against its various enemies on several fronts simultaneously. It was a powerful weapon that was both flexible and highly adaptable, and the Latin Church was more than willing to direct it against other Christians as well, such as Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Frederick was excommunicated by the Church on the basis that he had failed to fulfill his vows to participate in the failed Fifth Crusade. But Frederick had every intention to fulfill his vows, and the only reason he had not done so was because he had fallen ill. In fact, Frederick did go to the Holy Land as soon as he recovered. And not only did Frederick make it all the way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem as he had promised in his vows, but would go on to score a diplomatic victory previously thought to have been impossible. Incredibly, Frederick II managed to successfully negotiate the peaceful restoration of Jerusalem to Christian rule, returning the city to the Crusader kingdom named after it. And if that wasn't impressive enough, Frederick pulled this off after his excommunication by the Pope. Relations between Frederick and the papacy improved somewhat when he returned to Europe, but only briefly. By 1245, the Curia had labeled him a heretic and a crusade was authorized against him after he and the papacy found themselves in conflict over southern Italy. The city of Jerusalem did not remain in Christian hands for long, and was recaptured by the Muslims, prompting what turned out to be the greatest crusade expedition of the 13th century. Led by King Louis IX of France, the expedition was well financed, and the Crusaders gave themselves ample time to prepare in advance. But Louis's brother made a foolish mistake early on, and made a reckless, last-minute decision to lead his troops in a charge at the Battle of Mansoura, resulting in heavy losses for Louis's army. From there, the situation only got worse for the Crusaders. Sick and starving, Louis and his forces had to surrender. Louis remained in the Holy Land for 4 more years after that, in which he tried to bolster the defenses of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. As for the Ayyubid Sultanate, it was somewhat short-lived, and Saladin's heirs ultimately lost all their territory to a new Islamic power in Egypt, ruled by former slave soldiers known as the Mamelukes. And after overthrowing their masters and driving their Ayyubid rivals from Cairo, the Mameluke armies established a sultanate of their own, making Cairo their new capital. Much like the Crusaders, the Mameluke leader, Sultan Baybars, was also interested in holy war, and his military campaigns against the Crusader states played a large part in their eventual demise. In the end, however, it was a different sultan, Al-Ashraf, who smashed into the city of Acre, eliminating the last Crusader foothold in the Holy Land. After that, no further crusades were attempted to recover the Holy Land for the Christians. But it was not the end of crusading, and the effects of the original crusades continued to have an effect long after they occurred. In the early 14th century, the leaders of the Knights Templar were arrested in France on charges of heresy. Originally established as a military order of Crusader mercenaries, the Templars had since established themselves as a powerful banking cartel, and King Philip IV of France happened to be in debt to them. So Philip persuaded Pope Clement V to condemn the Templar leaders as heretics. They were publicly burned alive. Of course, they were far from the only group condemned by the Church for heresy, and many others were targeted by the papacy as well, such as the Hussites of Bohemia. But it would be the Albigensian heretics of southern France that would ultimately become the targets of one of the most intense anti-heresy campaigns in the history of the Latin Church. They were known as the Cathars, a Gnostic sect whose worldview differed radically from Roman Catholic dogma. Seeking to replace the local elite of southern France, the Cathar sect rapidly expanded into a growing movement, and the Church was determined to exterminate them. The Church recruited Simon of Montfort to lead a crusade against the Cathars, and he led a mercenary army into southern France to annihilate the movement. But they failed in this endeavor. Ultimately, the papacy deployed a new weapon against them, known as the Inquisition, which became the militant wing of the Roman Catholic Church. And unlike Simon Montfort's crusade, the Inquisition managed to eradicate the Cathars. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista eventually drove the Muslims from the peninsula completely. And following a major victory by Christian forces at Las Novas de Tolosa, the last Muslim forces had effectively been pinned down to the very south of the peninsula. It was not until 1492, however, that the Reconquista campaign was finally completed when Ferdinand and Isabella brought the full strength of the Spanish crown to bear upon Granada. The Hospitallers were another military order, originally founded in the Holy Land, but they took control of Malta after winning a major victory against the Ottoman Turks. They ruled the island until Napoleon deposed them in 1798. Okay, that has to be all of them, right? I think I lost count after the fourth one. I counted at least 9, though.